On July 11, 1944, a German Feldwebel named Kurt Brandt crouched behind a hedgerow outside the village of St. Jean Delaware Day in Normandy and watched an American rifle platoon through a gap in the bocage. He had been watching them for almost 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, a German sniper, positioned 40 m to Brandt's left, had put a bullet through the head of the American lieutenant leading the platoon. Brandt had seen the officer drop. He had seen the platoon scatter into the ditch. He had seen what, by every rule of warfare he understood, should have happened next. The platoon should have frozen. It should have milled. Someone should have run back toward the rear to find a company commander. That was what happened to every unit that lost its officer. French, British, Polish, Russian. The head comes off and the body stops. But this platoon did something Brandt had never seen before. Within 30 seconds, a staff sergeant, Brandt could not know his name, was Gerald Henley, 23 from Terre Haute, Indiana, stepped into the dead lieutenant's position. He did not hesitate. He did not call for instructions. He hand-signaled 2 men forward, pointed a third toward the hedgerow on the right flank, and began moving the platoon in a wide arc around the sniper's position. The squad moved faster now, not slower, faster. As if the loss of the officer had removed something heavy from the machine rather than something essential. And Brandt, a 12-year veteran of the Wehrmacht who had fought in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, wrote something that night in a letter to his wife that he never mailed. He wrote that the Americans did not seem to need their officers. He wrote that killing their leaders did not break them. And he wrote a sentence that, if he had known it, captured the central mystery that German soldiers across the entire Western Front were trying to understand in the summer of 1944. He wrote, "When you kill their shepherd, the sheep become wolves." If this story moves you, a like helps it reach others who care about these men. And if you're new here, subscribe. Brandt was not the only German soldier puzzled by what he was seeing. Across Normandy, from the hedgerows of the Cotentin Peninsula to the rubble of St. Lo, German after-action reports from June and July of 1944 began noting the same phenomenon with something close to disbelief. German tactical doctrine, arguably the most sophisticated in the world at that time, was built on a specific assumption about how armies work. That assumption was simple, and it had been true for centuries. An officer is the brain of a unit. Kill the brain, and the body dies. The Germans had perfected this. Their snipers were trained to identify officers by the way they carried themselves. The ones who looked at maps, who pointed, who stood slightly apart. Their machine gunners were taught to sweep fire across command groups first. Their mortar crews prioritized positions where radio antennas clustered. The logic was clean and proven. It had broken Polish battalions in 39. It had shattered French companies in 40. It had cracked Soviet regiments on the Dnieper. And now, in Normandy, it was not working. Not just failing, backfiring. German intelligence officers began compiling reports of American units that lost their lieutenants and fought harder. Platoons that lost their captains and still maneuvered. Companies that lost every commissioned officer and refused to stop advancing. One report, filed by the 352nd Infantry Division, the same division that had defended Omaha Beach, noted that American squads appeared to operate under some form of distributed command that the reporting officer could not identify. He used a phrase that would have been unthinkable in the German army. He said the Americans seemed to have officers hidden inside every rank. That phrase, officers hidden inside every rank, is the key to everything that follows. Because the German officer who wrote it did not realize he had just described in 9 words an entire philosophy of war that the United States Army had built from scratch in less than 3 years. A philosophy so foreign to the German military tradition that even after they identified its effects, they could not understand its cause. And even after they understood its cause, they could not copy it. The reason they could not copy it had nothing to do with tactics. It had nothing to do with weapons. It had to do with something buried so deep in the structure of the Wehrmacht that no general could fix it and no order could change it. But before we get to what the Germans could not copy, we need to understand what they were looking at. And that story starts not in Normandy, but in a place called Fort Benning, Georgia, 18 months before D-Day, in a classroom where a former shoe salesman from Ohio was learning how to read a map. In January of 1943, a 24-year-old corporal named Raymond Zussman stood in a line of 204 men outside a clapboard barracks at Fort Benning, Georgia. 6 months earlier, Zussman had been selling shoes at a department store in Hamtramck, Michigan, a Polish neighborhood wedged inside Detroit where his parents had settled after leaving Russia. He had been drafted, sent to basic training, and then because he scored in the top bracket on the Army General Classification Test, offered something that no army in Europe would have offered a man like him: a chance to become an officer. The program was called Officer Candidate School. The men who survived it were called 90-day wonders because in roughly 90 days, the United States Army took enlisted men with no military pedigree, no family connections, no university degree in many cases, and turned them into second lieutenants. The term was a joke. It was also, as the Germans would discover, a profound underestimation of what the program actually produced. Here is what mattered about OCS, and here is what you need to remember, because this detail will change the meaning of everything you see later. OCS did not simply train officers. It did something far more dangerous to any army fighting against it. It made the line between officer and enlisted man disappear. In the German Wehrmacht, that line was a wall. The German officer corps was, by tradition and by design, a separate caste. To become an officer, a German soldier needed the Abitur, the equivalent of a university entrance diploma. He needed to pass a selection board of officers and psychiatrists. He needed the approval of his regimental commander. And even then, the path was barred to most non-commissioned officers in peacetime, because the officer corps was, and there is no softer way to say this, immensely class-conscious. A Feldwebel could spend 20 years leading men in combat and never cross the line into the officer ranks. Not because he lacked ability, because the system did not allow it. The American Army in 1941 looked at that line and erased it. Between July of 41 and the end of the war, over 100,000 enlisted men walked into OCS classrooms at Fort Benning and Fort Sill and a half-dozen other installations. They were former truck drivers and accountants and high school teachers, and, in Raymond Zussman's case, shoe salesmen. They sat in classrooms for 17 weeks. They learned to read contour maps and call artillery fire and plan a platoon assault and write a 5-paragraph field order. 2 out of 3 made it through. The ones who failed went back to their units as privates, but they went back knowing how an officer thinks. And that is the detail that matters, because in the German army, knowledge flowed downward. An officer decided. An NCO executed. A private followed. If the officer fell, the NCO could continue the plan, but only the plan that had already been made. The NCO had been trained to fight inside a framework. He had not been trained to build one. In the American Army, knowledge bled sideways. The sergeant in a rifle squad might be a man who had washed out of OCS and come back to the line knowing how to read a terrain map as well as any lieutenant. The corporal next to him might be a man who had been offered OCS and turned it down because he preferred to stay with his squad. The private on the bar might be a man who had scored 130 on the classification test, higher than most officers, and simply hadn't been selected yet. This meant something that no German doctrine had prepared for. It meant that in an American rifle squad of 12 men, there was not one leader. There were layers. The staff sergeant led. The sergeant was his shadow, trained to take over without a pause. Below them, every man in the squad had been trained not just to follow orders, but to understand the purpose behind them. And if the purpose survived and the officer did not, the squad kept moving. Raymond Zussman graduated from OCS in the spring of 43. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant, assigned to the 756th Tank Battalion, and shipped to France in the summer of 44. On September 12, 1944, near the town of Nory-le-Borg in eastern France, Zussman did something that revealed exactly what kind of officer OCS produced. But that story belongs later. For now, remember his name and remember what he was before the army found him. A shoe salesman, a corporal, a man who, in the German army, would never have been allowed to command. What the Germans were facing in Normandy was not an army that had better officers. It was an army where the concept of officer had been distributed so widely that it could not be destroyed by killing any single person. But distributed leadership is only half the equation. The other half, the half that truly baffled the Germans, was happening not in officer schools, but in the rifle squads themselves, in the way American sergeants were trained, in what they were expected to do when the plan fell apart, and in a small, almost invisible structural decision that the Army had made in 1940. a decision about how many leaders to put inside a single 12-man squad. That decision is what the Germans ran into on Omaha Beach, and it nearly broke their entire theory of war. In 1940, a year before Pearl Harbor, the United States Army made a change to its infantry squad that looked, on paper, like a minor administrative adjustment. The squad grew from 8 men to 12. The corporal who had led it was replaced by a staff sergeant, and a second NCO, a sergeant, was added as assistant squad leader. That was it. A few lines in a field manual, no press conference, no congressional debate. But that single change created something the German army had never encountered and would spend the rest of the war trying to understand. Here's why it mattered. In a German infantry squad of 10 men, leadership ran through one channel. The Gruppenführer, the squad leader, usually a sergeant or a Stabsfreiter, was the brain. His assistant handled ammunition supply and filled in if the leader fell, but the squad was built around the MG-34 machine gun. The rifleman existed to feed the gun, protect the gun, and advance the gun. Tactical decisions radiated from the squad leader downward. If the squad leader was killed, the assistant could keep the gun firing. But the squad's ability to maneuver, to improvise, to adapt to something the plan hadn't anticipated, degraded immediately. The American squad was built on a completely different principle. The staff sergeant and the sergeant divided the squad into functional teams. By 43, doctrine formalized what was already happening in the field. The squad operated in 3 semi-autonomous groups. Able Team, the scouts, out front. Baker Team, the base of fire built around the bar. And Charlie Team, the maneuvering element, the largest group, the ones who flanked. Each team could act on its own. Not indefinitely, not without coordination, but for the critical minutes after a leader went down, each team knew its job and could execute without waiting for orders. The staff sergeant might be directing the whole squad. The sergeant might be running Charlie Team on the flank. If the staff sergeant was killed, the sergeant took over, and the senior man in Charlie Team took the sergeant's role. If both NCOs went down, the barman and Baker Team, usually the most experienced private, kept firing, and the scouts in Able Team kept scouting. The Germans had nothing like this. Not because they lacked tactical sophistication. In many ways, German small unit tactics were the best in the world, but because the German system concentrated decision-making in officers and squad leaders by design. The American system distributed it by design, and the difference between those two philosophies showed up most clearly in the one place where officers died fastest. Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944, 6:30 in the morning. The German defenders of the 352nd Infantry Division had prepared for this moment with Prussian precision. Their machine guns were sighted to create interlocking fields of fire across every meter of sand. Their mortars were pre-registered on the waterline, and their snipers, positioned in bunkers along the bluffs, had one specific instruction: kill the men who look like they are in charge. They were devastatingly effective. In the first hour, the majority of officers in the first assault wave were dead or wounded. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment lost over 90% of its men. The tactical plan, which companies would land where, which platoons would assault which draws, was destroyed before the first soldier reached the seawall. Radios were waterlogged, maps were lost. The chain of command, as the army had designed it on paper, ceased to exist. And here is where the German assumption broke. The men at the seawall did not freeze. They did not wait for new officers to arrive. Up and down the beach, in isolated clusters of 8, 10, 15 men from shattered companies that had been scrambled together by the current, sergeants began doing exactly what they had been trained to do. They looked at the terrain. They identified a gap. They organized the men nearest to them, regardless of unit, regardless of whether they had ever met, and they moved. Staff Sergeant Warner Hamlet of Company D, 116th Infantry, gathered men from 3 different units at the base of the bluff. He could not reach his company commander because his company commander was dead. He could not contact battalion because the radios were gone. What he could do was look German pillbox above him, identify the connecting trench behind it, and lead a squad-sized assault that rolled up the position from the rear. No officer ordered that assault. No battalion commander planned it. Hamlet saw the problem, built the solution, and executed it, exactly as his training at a replacement depot in Alabama had taught him to do 8 months earlier. He was not unique. He was not exceptional. He was the system working as designed. By 9:30 that morning, the German garrison in Omaha was reporting something that did not fit their model of the battle. American troops, leaderless, disorganized, without radios or heavy weapons, were appearing on the bluffs behind the defensive positions. Small groups, 5 men here, 8 men there, moving without apparent coordination, but with consistent purpose. Get off the beach, get behind the guns, and kill the men firing them. The 352 ND Division's after-action report noted these penetrations with alarm, but buried in the report was a detail that the division's intelligence officer could not explain. The Americans who were breaking through were not being led by officers. They were being led by sergeants, and the sergeants were not following the original plan because there was no plan left to follow. They were making new ones. Remember that phrase from Part 1, officers hidden inside every rank? This is what it looked like in practice. And Omaha Beach was only the beginning because what the Germans saw on June 6th was the American system under maximum stress. When everything that could fail had failed. What they had not yet seen was what happened when that system was given time to learn. And what it learned in the hedgerows of Normandy over the next 8 weeks would terrify them. The bocage was hell designed by agriculture. For 1,000 years, Norman farmers had divided their fields with earthen walls 4 to 6 feet high, topped with dense hedgerows of hawthorn and bramble, rooted so deep that a bulldozer could not push through them. Every field was a fortress. Every lane was an ambush corridor. Every intersection was a kill zone. The American army that broke out of Omaha Beach and pushed inland in mid-June of '44 was built for open warfare, for movement, for flanking, for the kind of sweeping maneuver that Patton dreamed about in his sleep. The bocage negated all of it. A Sherman tank could not crash through a hedgerow without exposing its belly armor, the thinnest part, to whatever anti-tank gun was waiting on the other side. Infantry advancing down a lane could be cut apart by a single MG-42 positioned at the far end. And because every field looked identical from the air, artillery forward observers could not distinguish their own positions from the enemy's. The Germans understood the bocage perfectly. They had been fortifying it for months. And their defensive doctrine, which relied on small, well-trained units holding prepared positions and counterattacking at the moment the attacker was most exposed, was ideally suited to this terrain. A single German squad with 1 machine gun and 2 riflemen could hold a hedgerow intersection for hours. In the first 2 weeks of hedgerow fighting, American casualties were staggering. The 19th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division lost 700 men in its first 17 days in the bocage. Company-grade officers, the lieutenants and captains who led platoons and companies, were being killed or wounded at a rate that made replacement impossible. A rifle company that landed on D-Day with 6 officers might have 1 left by the end of June, and that one was frequently a man who had been a sergeant 72 hours earlier. This is the moment where the German assumption should have been confirmed. This is where, by every principle the Wehrmacht understood, the American advance should have collapsed into disorganized chaos. Their officers were gone. Their plans were useless. Their tactics, designed for open ground, did not work. By every measure the German army used to predict an enemy's breaking point, the American infantry in the bocage should have broken. Instead, something happened that German commanders along the front began reporting with increasing frequency and increasing unease. The American squads were adapting, not at the division level, not because some general in a chateau 30 miles behind the lines had issued a new tactical directive. The adaptation was happening at the bottom, squad by squad, sergeant by sergeant, field by field. Here's what that looked like. A staff sergeant whose name has been lost to the records. He is identified only as the squad leader of a unit in the 29th Division sometime in late June tried 4 different methods to cross a single hedgerow field in one afternoon. The first was a frontal assault down the lane, 2 men killed. The second was a flanking movement through the adjacent field, 1 man wounded when the flanking team hit the same problem in the next hedgerow. The third was a coordinated move with a Sherman. The tank pushed through the hedgerow and was immediately hit by a Panzerfaust. The fourth attempt worked. The sergeant had a bar man lay suppressive fire at the base of the far hedgerow, not to kill anyone, but to keep the German machine gunner's head down for 45 seconds. During those 45 seconds, 2 riflemen crept along the inside edge of the side hedgerow, reached the corner, and threw grenades over the top and into the German position. The squad then moved through the gap the grenades had created. No field manual described that technique. No officer designed it. A 23-year-old sergeant figured it out because 4 men had been hit, and he needed to find a way that did not kill a 5th. And here is the part that baffled the Germans. That sergeant's technique did not stay with his squad. Within days, variations of it were appearing across the 29th Division's front. Not because headquarters had published a bulletin, although eventually it would, but because American NCOs talked to each other. When squads rotated off the line, their sergeants compared notes. What worked? What killed people? Which hedgerow configurations required which approach? Knowledge moved laterally, from sergeant to sergeant, from squad to squad, at a speed that the German chain of command, with its vertical flow of information from officer to officer, could not match. By mid-July, less than 6 weeks after D-Day, American infantry squads in the Bocage had developed a repertoire of hedgerow crossing techniques so varied that German defenders could not predict which one would be used on any given field. Every attack was slightly different because every sergeant was solving the problem with his own variation. The Germans, defending the same terrain with the same doctrine, were fighting the same way in the 3rd week as they had in the 1st. This was not because German soldiers were less intelligent or less brave. It was because their system processed innovation differently. In the Wehrmacht, a new technique had to be observed, reported up the chain, evaluated by officers, formalized into a directive, and distributed back down. In the American Army, a new technique had to survive one hedgerow. If the sergeant who invented it was still alive when his squad reached the other side, it worked. And by nightfall, 3 other sergeants had heard about it. The speed of this bottom-up adaptation created a compounding problem for the German defense. Every week, the Americans were better at crossing hedgerows. Every week, the cost of holding each field rose for the defenders. The Germans were not losing because they were outgunned. In the Bocage, firepower advantages largely disappeared. They were losing because the American army was learning faster than they were. And the learning was happening in a place the German command structure could not reach, in the conversations between sergeants in foxholes after dark. But the Bocage, brutal as it was still a limited theater. The true test, the one that would reveal the deepest layer of the American system, was coming. It would arrive on a freezing December morning in a forest called the Ardennes, when 3 German armies smashed through the American line and destroyed the chain of command across an 80-mile front. What happened next is the reason German generals, years after the war, still could not fully explain what they had fought against. December 16, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. The Ardennes Forest. A German artillery barrage of over 1,600 guns opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front in eastern Belgium and Luxembourg. The shells hit American positions that had been quiet for weeks, rest areas, replacement depots, rear echelon command posts. The barrage was followed by 250,000 German troops in 20 divisions, including elite panzer units that had been refitting in secret for months. The offensive was called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. It was Hitler's final gamble, and its opening blow fell on the thinnest, weakest section of the entire Allied line. Holding that line were 2 American divisions. One, the 99th, was experienced but badly under strength. The other, the 106th, had been in combat for exactly 5 days. Within hours, the German assault did precisely what it was designed to do. It shattered the American chain of command. Communication lines were cut. Headquarters were overrun. Entire battalions were surrounded before they understood what was happening. The 106th Division lost 2 of its 3 regiments. Nearly 7,000 men captured in one of the largest mass surrenders in American military history. Officers were killed, captured, or separated from their units across the entire front. By nightfall on December 16th, thousands of American soldiers were scattered through the frozen forest in groups of 5, 10, 20. Without officers, without radios, without orders, and without any idea where the German advance had reached. By every rule the German command understood, this should have been the end. Not the end of the war, but the end of organized American resistance along the breakthrough corridor. The German plan assumed that once the command structure was destroyed, the American units would do what shattered units always did: surrender, scatter, or freeze in place. Kampfgruppe Paper, the armored spearhead of the 6th SS Panzer Army, was expected to reach the Meuse River bridges within 48 hours. Paper never reached the Meuse, and the reason he did not is the reason this story exists. Because those scattered American soldiers, the ones without officers, without orders, without a plan, did not scatter. They coalesced, not into the units they had belonged to. Those units no longer existed. They coalesced into something the German army had no word for. Improvised combat teams built from the debris of a dozen broken formations, organized not by rank or unit assignment, but by whoever was present and whoever was willing to lead. And the men who were willing to lead were, almost without exception, sergeants. Along the northern shoulder of the German penetration, near a ridge called Elsenborn, American defenders held a position that the German timetable required them to abandon within hours. They held it for days. The defense was not organized by a general. It was organized by company commanders and platoon sergeants who looked at the ground, identified the high points, and refused to leave them. When company commanders fell, platoon sergeants took over. When platoon sergeants fell, squad leaders took over. The position held because at every level, someone was trained to step up, and the man below him was trained to let him. Further south, where the breakthrough was deepest, the situation was more chaotic and the American response more revealing. Retreating soldiers from the 106th, the 28th, and the 110th Infantry met each other on frozen roads in the dark. They did not know each other. They did not share radio frequencies. Many had abandoned equipment. Some had no weapons. What happened next is documented in dozens of after-action reports, and the pattern is always the same. A sergeant, sometimes a staff sergeant, sometimes a tech sergeant, occasionally a buck sergeant barely older than the privates around him, would stop at a crossroads, a farmhouse, a bridge. He would look at the men streaming past and begin pulling them aside. Not by unit, not by specialty, by availability. You, can you still fire a rifle? Good. You, do you have ammunition? Share it. You three, take that ditch and cover the road from the east. Everyone else, dig in. These improvised positions, thrown together by NCOs who had never met the men they were commanding, became the friction that slowed and ultimately stopped the German advance at dozens of critical points. Not one of them was ordered by a higher headquarters. Not one of them appeared in any operational plan. They existed because American sergeants had been trained to do something that German NCOs had not. To look at a disintegrating situation and build a new structure from the pieces. Consider what that required. A German Feldwebel, no matter how experienced, had been trained within a system where initiative operated inside a framework provided by an officer. The officer defined the mission. The NCO executed it. If the officer was gone and the mission was obsolete, as it was across the entire Ardennes front on December 16th, the Feldwebel had no doctrinal basis for creating a new mission on his own. He could fight. He could defend. He could retreat in good order. But the act of standing at a crossroads, collecting strangers, assigning them positions, and deciding, without any guidance from above, that this crossroads would be held, that was an officer's decision. And the Feldwebel was not an officer. The system had spent his entire career making sure he understood the difference. The American sergeant had no such limitation. Not because he was braver, not because he was smarter, but because the system he came from had never told him that leadership was someone else's job. He had been trained to lead his squad. He had been trained to take over the platoon. And if there was no platoon left, he had been trained to build one from whatever was available. This is the third layer of the answer. The one that goes deeper than squad structure, deeper than OCS. The American system did not just distribute leadership. It distributed the authority to create new units from nothing. And that authority lived in the NCO Corps. But there is a fourth layer still. A layer the Germans glimpsed only in the last months of the war when they interrogated captured American sergeants and discovered something about their training that no intelligence report had prepared them for. Something about what happened inside a classroom at Fort Benning that had nothing to do with tactics. It had to do with a question. And the question was the most dangerous weapon the American Army ever built. In the summer of 1942, the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia was processing more human beings than any educational institution in the history of the world. 17 weeks of training, class after class, hundreds of men arriving every Monday, hundreds graduating every Friday. The scale was industrial, But inside the classroom, something was happening that was not industrial at all. The instructors at Fort Benning, many of them NCOs who had trained at the pre-war regular army schools, used the teaching method that no German military academy would have recognized. They gave their students problems with no correct answer, not problems with difficult answers, not problems with multiple choice answers. Problems where the instructor himself did not know the best solution because the best solution depended on terrain, weather, the enemy, the men available, and a dozen variables that changed every time the problem was presented. A squad is pinned behind a stone wall. One man has a bar with 2 magazines. There is a drainage ditch to the left that may or may not lead behind the enemy position. Your platoon leader is dead. The company commander is out of radio range. What do? The students argued. They proposed. They disagreed. And the instructor, a staff sergeant usually, with a combat infantryman badge and a look that discouraged nonsense, did not tell them who was right. He told them to explain why. Why that ditch and not the wall? Why suppress first and flank second? Why send 2 men instead of 3? That word, why, was the weapon. Because why does something to a soldier's mind that no amount of drill can accomplish. Drill teaches a man to execute. Repetition teaches a man to react. But asking why teaches a man to think. And a man who has been trained to think cannot be rendered helpless by the death of the man who used to think for him. The German training system, for all its rigor and tactical brilliance, asked a different question. It asked what? What is the correct formation for a squad assault? What is the proper response to an enemy flanking movement? What does doctrine prescribe for a meeting engagement? The answers were precise, well-tested, and uniform. A German squad leader who graduated from NCO training in Potsdam knew exactly what to do in 47 distinct tactical situations because he had memorized the correct response to each one. But situation number 48, the one that did not match any template, the one where the officer was dead and the terrain was wrong and the enemy was doing something no instructor had anticipated, was the situation the German system had not prepared him for. And the Western Front in 1944 was made almost entirely of situation number 48. Here is how the difference played out in practice. And this is a story worth hearing closely because it contains the clearest illustration of what German interrogators discovered when they began questioning captured American NCOs in the autumn of 44. In October of that year, near the Hurtgen Forest, a nightmare of shattered pines and frozen mud along the German border, a German intelligence unit captured a staff sergeant from the 4th Infantry Division. The sergeant's name, rank, and unit were recorded. His equipment was catalogued. And then, because German intelligence had begun to notice that American sergeants seemed to know more than sergeants should, he was questioned not just about troop positions, but about his training. What the interrogators heard confused them. The sergeant described a training exercise at a replacement depot in England months before D-Day, in which his platoon was given a tactical problem and told to solve it without any input from the supervising officer. The officer, the sergeant explained, stood in the corner and watched. He did not correct. He did not suggest. He waited until the platoon had argued its way to a plan. And then he asked them a single question. What happens to your plan if I am killed in the first 5 minutes? The platoon revised the plan. The officer asked, what happens if your sergeant is also killed? They revised it again. What if you lose the radio? Revision. What if the enemy is not where you expect them to be? Revision. By the end of the exercise, the platoon had not one plan, but 5. Each designed to function with progressively fewer leaders and progressively less information. The German interrogator wrote in his report that the American sergeant described this exercise as routine, not special, not advanced, something every replacement went through before being shipped to the front. The interrogator noted, and you can almost hear the disquiet in his language, that the exercise appeared designed to produce soldiers who expected their officers to die. That observation was more accurate than the interrogator realized. The American system did not merely acknowledge that officers would be killed. It planned for it. It trained for it. It built redundancy into every level of command the way an engineer builds redundancy into a bridge, not because the bridge is expected to fail, but because when it does fail, people are standing on it. The German system did not build this redundancy, not because German officers were arrogant or German planners were negligent, but because the philosophical foundation of the Wehrmacht made it structurally impossible. In the German military tradition, an officer was not merely a leader. He was the carrier of something called Verantwortungsfreudigkeit, joy in responsibility. The word itself reveals the assumption that the willingness to bear responsibility, to decide under pressure, to accept consequences, was an elite quality that separated officers from enlisted men. It was not taught to NCOs. It was not expected of them. It was the defining characteristic of the officer class. And so, when that class was destroyed, as it was on Omaha Beach, in the Bocage, in the Ardennes, the German army lost something it could not replace from below. Not men, not firepower, not courage. It lost the layer of the organization that was permitted to decide. The American army had no such layer, or rather, it had made every layer that layer. That is the fourth and deepest answer to the question in this video's title. The Germans were puzzled because they were looking at an army that had solved a problem they did not even know they had. The problem was not how to fight without officers. The problem was how to build an army where the word without did not apply, because the thing the officer carried had been given to everyone. Raymond Zussman, the shoe salesman from Hamtramck, the OCS graduate, the 90-day wonder, proved what that looked like in September of 1944. And his story is the one that brings all of this together. September 12, 1944. The village of Nora-le-Bourg, eastern France. Second Lieutenant Raymond Zussman, the shoe salesman, the corporal, the man who would have been permanently barred from command in the German army, was riding on the back of a Sherman tank with his infantry platoon when they hit a German defensive line outside the village. What happened in the next 2 hours earned Zussman the Medal of Honor. But what matters for this story is not the medal. It is what his actions revealed about the system that made him. The German position was dug in along a tree line with interlocking machine gun nests and at least 2 anti-tank guns covering the road. Zussman's company commander was not in contact. The radio was out, a recurring theme in 1944. Zussman had no orders beyond the general directive to advance through Nora-le-Bourg. He had a platoon of infantry, 2 Sherman tanks, and a problem that required an officer's decision. He made the decision in seconds. He put his infantry in a ditch on the left side of the road, climbed on top of the lead Sherman, exposed, standing, visible to every German gunner in the tree line, and directed the tank's fire onto the first machine gun position by pointing at it. When the position was suppressed, he jumped off the tank, led his platoon forward on foot, and personally entered the German trench system. He killed 2 German soldiers with his carbine. He captured 18 more. Then he got back on the tank and moved to the next position. He did this repeatedly across the length of the German line. In those 2 hours, Zussman advanced his platoon through the village, knocked out 2 machine gun nests and 1 anti-tank position, killed 17 German soldiers, and captured 92. His company commander was never in radio contact for any of it. Now, consider what a German intelligence officer would have seen if he had been watching from the other side. He would have seen an American lieutenant leading not from behind, not from a command post, but from the top of a tank, making tactical decisions in real time without orders from above. He would have seen that lieutenant's platoon operating smoothly behind him, each squad maneuvering independently to exploit the openings he created. He would have seen the squads functioning without direct supervision because their sergeants knew what to do without being told. And if that German officer had then looked up Zussman's personnel file, if he had discovered that this lieutenant had been a corporal 18 months earlier, a shoe salesman 6 months before that, he would have confronted the full weight of what the American system had built. An army where a shoe salesman could become a combat officer in 90 days. An army where that officer's sergeants could replace him if he fell. An army where those sergeants' privates had been trained to understand why they were doing what they were doing, not just what to do. Raymond Zussman did not survive the war. On September 21, 1944, 9 days after Nora-le-Bourg, he was killed by a German sniper near the town of Radon-et-Chapendu. He was 26 years old. His Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously. In the German army, his death would have mattered more. Not because the Germans valued their officers less, they valued them enormously, perhaps too much, but because the German system was built on irreplaceable men. When an experienced German lieutenant fell, the unit felt it immediately. The Feldwebel who stepped up could keep the men fighting, but the tactical creativity, the authority to rewrite the plan, the confidence to make a decision that contradicted the last order, those things had left with the officer. They were qualities the system reserved for a caste, and the caste was dying. By the winter of '44, German officer casualties on the Western Front were catastrophic. Divisions that had crossed into France with full complements of experienced officers were now being led by men who, in peacetime, would never have been permitted near a command. The Wehrmacht had begun promoting NCOs to officer rank out of desperation, doing in defeat what the American army had done by design from the start. But there was a difference. The Americans had built a system around the assumption that anyone could lead. The Germans were forcing men into roles the system had spent their careers telling them they were not qualified for. The result was visible on every battlefield. German units with experienced officers still fought brilliantly. The defense of the Hurtgen Forest, the counterattacks during the Bulge, the delaying actions along the Siegfried Line, all proved that German tactical skill remained formidable when the command structure was intact. But when the structure cracked, when the officers fell and the NCOs had to improvise beyond their training, German units became brittle in ways that American units did not. An American infantry company that lost its captain in the morning could be attacking a fortified position by the afternoon under its first sergeant. A German company that lost its hauptmann might hold its position, but the counterattack, the creative response, the decision to shift the defense to a better piece of ground 200 m to the east, those required an officer, and the officer was dead. This asymmetry, invisible on paper, devastating in practice, compounded over months. By March of '45, when American forces were crossing the Rhine, German defenders along the river reported the same phenomenon that Kurt Brandt had noticed in the hedgerows of Normandy 8 months earlier. American units that took casualties did not slow down. They reorganized on the move. They promoted from within so fast that German intelligence could not keep track of the command structure. A man who was a sergeant on Monday was a platoon leader by Wednesday, and the platoon did not miss a step, because to the privates following him, nothing had really changed. The sergeant had always been leading. Now he was just doing it with a different title. The Germans had a word for what they were witnessing. They called it unheimlich, uncanny, because an army that does not weaken when you cut off its head is not behaving the way armies are supposed to behave. But there was one more thing the Germans never learned. Something about what happened after the war, when American NCOs went home, something that explains not just how the system worked, but why it existed in the first place. Kurt Brandt, the Feldwebel who watched an American platoon reorganize itself in 30 seconds outside Saint-Jean-de-Dié, survived the war. He was captured by the British near Hamburg in May of 1945 and spent 14 months in a prisoner of war camp in Yorkshire before being released in the summer of '46. He returned to his hometown of Kassel, which had been 80% destroyed by Allied bombing. He found work as a bricklayer rebuilding the city he had left as a soldier. In 1951, a German journalist conducting interviews with former Wehrmacht soldiers for a newspaper series about the Western Front sat down with Brandt in a cafe near the Hauptbahnhof. The journalist asked what had surprised him most about the Americans. Brandt's answer took up less than 2 lines in the published article, but it said everything. He said, "We could not understand it. We would kill their officers, and instead of stopping, they would get faster. It was as if we were doing them a favor. Doing them a favor." From a man who had fought across 4 countries and 3 fronts. That sentence carried the quiet weight of total bewilderment. He was not being sarcastic. He was stating what he had seen, and what he had seen was an army that had been engineered, consciously, deliberately, from the first day of basic training to the last hedgerow in Bavaria, to treat the loss of a leader not as a catastrophe, but as a transition. A transition so smooth, so rehearsed, so deeply embedded in the culture of every squad and platoon, that the enemy could not detect the seam. The German army never solved this puzzle, not during the war and not in the decades of military analysis that followed. German Staff College studies in the 1950s examined American small unit performance in Normandy, the Bulge, and the Rhineland, and repeatedly returned to the same conclusion. The American system should not have worked. It violated fundamental principles of military command. It placed authority in the hands of men who, by German standards, were not qualified to hold it. It relied on initiative from soldiers who had been in uniform for less than 2 years, and yet it worked. Not in spite of those things, but because of them. Because the Americans had understood something that the Germans, With their centuries of military tradition, their Kriegseconomy, their Auftragstaktik, their Verantwortungsvollständigkeit, had never grasped. They understood that leadership is not a rank. It is not a diploma. It is not a class. It is a skill. And like any skill, it can be taught to anyone willing to learn it. A shoe salesman from Michigan, a farm boy from Indiana, a clerk from Ohio. Give them the training. Give them the authority. Give them the expectation that they will lead, and they will lead. Raymond Zussman, the shoe salesman who became a lieutenant, who became a Medal of Honor recipient, is buried at the Epinal American Cemetery in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France. Row 8, Grave 44. He was 26 when a sniper's bullet found him 9 days after the battle that defined his life. He never went back to Hamtramck. He never sold another pair of shoes. But the system that made him, the system that found a leader inside a corporal and gave that leader a commission and a platoon, that system survived him. It is still the backbone of the United States Army today. Staff Sergeant Gerald Henley, the man Kurt Brandt watched take over the platoon in 30 seconds, survived the war and returned to Terre Haute. He married a woman named Dorothy in 1946. He worked for the post office for 31 years. He never spoke about the hedgerows. When his son asked him, decades later, what he had done in the war, Henley said, "I did what the man next to me needed me to do." That sentence is the answer to this video's title. The Germans were puzzled because they were looking at an army where every man had been trained to be the man next to him, where leadership was not a pyramid with one man at the top, but a web, where every thread could carry the weight if the others broke, where killing the officer did not remove the brain from the body, because the brain had been copied into every limb. The Germans could not copy this, not because they lacked intelligence or discipline or courage. They had all three in abundance, but because copying it would have required them to dismantle the oldest and most sacred wall in their military tradition, the wall between the men who decide and the men who obey. And that wall was not built from doctrine. It was built from culture, from class, from centuries of a belief that leadership is a birthright, not a skill to be distributed like ammunition. The Americans had no such wall, or rather, they had torn it down in 1941 in a clapboard barracks at Fort Benning when they told a shoe salesman from Michigan that he could be an officer. And in doing so, they built the most resilient army the modern world had ever seen. An army that did not merely survive the loss of its leaders. An army that was designed for it. When you kill the shepherd, the sheep become wolves. The Germans never figured out why. Now you know. Thank you for spending these minutes with these men. If this story reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not subscribed, now is a good time. And the bell ensures you never miss one of these. I would love to hear where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor you grew up hearing stories from, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the ones you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.